Julius Caesar did not believe in an afterlife. His views on life after death were shaped by Epicurean philosophy, and he was of the opinion that there was no conscious existence beyond the grave. For him, the only immortality one could hope for then was to live on in legends as a moral exemplar, to be remembered by future generations as a paragon of Roman virtue and honor. Caesar was like many Roman aristocrats in this respect. Regardless of what they believed awaited them on the other side of death, they were fixated on securing an eternal legacy that would place them amongst the Republic's greatest heroes, men like Camillus and Scipio Africanus, or, to those of Caesar's populare political bent, the Gracchi brothers and Marius. Thus, though Caesar claimed to be content with his accomplishments after his victory in the Civil War, stating that he had lived long enough to satisfy both nature and glory, he still planned one more campaign, despite his relatively advanced age of 55. In March of 44 BCE, he was laying the final preparations for an invasion of Dacia, and then a war against the Parthians to avenge the death of his fellow Triumvir Crassus, just as he had sought justice by killing those who had slain his rival and one-time friend Pompey. The plan was ambitious, and indicates that despite his statements to the contrary, Caesar was not satisfied with his achievements to date, and felt that his record still needed a bit of polishing if he were to become the most famous Roman of all. Certainly, he did not want his triumph over fellow Romans to be counted as his greatest victory. The conquest of Parthia, then, would be the crowning achievement of Caesar's career, and opponents believed that the glory and honor that would result could lead to his actual crowning. Caesar was supposed to depart Rome to rendezvous with his legions on March 18th, but just days before this, he was cut down on the Ides of March by a conspiracy orchestrated by his friend Brutus, and that included not just staunch Pompeians he had forgiven, but also some of his own once loyal supporters. We cannot know what the results of Caesar's final campaign would have been, if it would have resulted in his name being forever engraved in Roman history, or sullied it with ignominy. But, ironically, it was this event, this tragic death, that would cement Caesar's legacy as a giant of Roman history. For not only did it leave Caesar's work unfinished, but it injected a note of tragedy into the final accounting of Caesar's life, provoking questions that will forever remain unanswered, that would not be posed had he died in his bed at a comfortable old age. But it is not just historians who must wrestle with uncertainty, for the shock of the event sent ripples through every aspect of Roman public life, and proved to be the impetus for the Republic's final series of civil wars, the very outcome Caesar had hoped to end forever by accumulating so much power under his aegis. But it was this very accumulation of power that made his position untenable within the Republic, as men who were just as hungry for glory and eternal fame began to view him as an impediment to their own advancement. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. Often, it is claimed that the concentration of power in Caesar's new and unique position as perpetual dictator was simply a way of him slowly becoming king, a conscious effort to assume the throne by increments, so as not to offend the fiercely anti-monarchical Romans. Clearly, this effort failed, as he ran afoul of Brutus, but acceding to this framing also requires arbitrarily privileging the perspective of his assassins over real evidence to the contrary. When viewed through the lens of his Parthian campaign, a necessary layer of nuance is added that makes Caesar's approach easier to understand and harder to write off as simple power grabs by an upstart monarch concerned only with his own position. It is obviously impossible to know the true intent of Caesar in the critical months between his arrival in Rome after the conclusion of the civil war in late 45 and his death on the Ides of March in 44. But all too often, popular retellings of his policies during this critical juncture simply assume that monarchy was the end goal, in effect justifying the assassination as tyrannicide, when, in reality, Caesar was much more preoccupied with planning his Parthian campaign than he was in permanently reshaping the Roman political order. So, while the logistical and military planning of the Parthian War does not preclude monarchical ambitions, it also offers a potential explanation for Caesar's concentration of power and influence that we cannot ignore when appraising his legacy, and weighing this against the merits of the conspiracy that took his life. Much scholarly ink has been spilled on Caesar's long-term plans for the Roman state, and his position within it. I am not looking to settle that debate here, but to provide another reading of these last months of Caesar's life that places the Parthian War at the forefront of his concerns, as something he viewed as far more pressing than either the establishment of a dynasty or the resurrection of the old republican order. For though Caesar sought to leverage this war to enhance his standing, it was popular among the Roman people, as wars of imperial conquest often are. A longing came over all the Romans alike to avenge Crassus and those who had perished with him, and they felt some hope of subjugating the Parthians then, if ever. They unanimously voted the command of the war to Caesar, and made ample provision for it. But the war was more than just a blind quest for revenge. Parthia had made significant incursions into Roman territory twice since the death of Crassus in 53, and posed a threat to Rome's efforts to solidify its eastern holdings. It was more than simple Roman honor or its sacred legionary standards at stake here then. Parthia had leveraged a period of disorder and civil war to its own advantage, to strengthen its standing in the region. It sensed Roman weakness, and Caesar knew that the raids and harassment would continue indefinitely unless Rome retaliated. But there is reason to suspect that there were pragmatic political goals at work as well. Caesar knew, perhaps better than any of his peers, that the Republican polity, as currently constructed, could not tolerate a period of sustained peace. The Roman economic base at this point relied on war not just to seize wealth and slaves, but to ease over social tensions and provide an outlet for simmering class frustrations, from the poorest plebeians to the noblest patrician. If an external enemy could not be identified, then Romans would turn their swords inward, much as they had over the past 50 years, when a suitable foe was lacking. The correlation between external war and internal stability is undeniable for this period of Republican history, and if we can perceive it at the remove of 2 millennia, then doubtless a politician of Caesar's ability was aware as well. He may not have couched his argument in the language of primitive accumulation, but there is no reason to doubt that he was blind to the benefits of such a conflict. Perhaps he believed that a unifying war, one that created shared national purpose while also providing ample opportunities for plunder, was necessary to reconstitute a republic fractured by generations of civil war. For, while the discontent among the future Ides of March conspirators is obvious, and thus well known, we cannot overlook that even the Caesarian coalition seems to have been fracturing under the weight of Caesar's permanent place at the apex of Roman politics. For example, an insurgent populare campaign for debt cancellation by Cicero's son-in-law Dolabella in 47 that outflanked Caesar on populist grounds went against his wishes for normal political life while he was away fighting the civil war, but, more importantly, had led to a seemingly irreparable rift between his partisans, Mark Antony and Dolabella, that was rooted just as much in personal enmity as it was in political posturing. The breakdown of unity within his own faction made Caesar realize that despite his victory in the civil war and the position it afforded him, he was far from the unquestioned master of Roman politics that we can sometimes perceive him as. In recognition of this, he decided to perform the unprecedented task of overseeing elections for 3 successive years of magistracies simultaneously. He did not want to risk a magistrate acting to disrupt peace and order on the Roman scene while he was abroad fighting the Parthians. Critically, we must recognize that the danger of disruption was perceived as emanating from ambitious populares spearheading reform campaigns to the same degree that Caesar would have worried about constitutionalist conservatives undermining the post-Civil War settlement. So, while the accelerated elections were a display of Caesar's unprecedented new power, we should also read them as an acknowledgement of his relative weakness. Though it seems that these elections were carried out in a somewhat constitutional fashion, it should be no surprise that Caesar's hand-picked candidates won all the offices for which they stood. Republican in form, but not function, critics perceived these elections as little more than underhanded appointments by Caesar of his loyalists to the most powerful positions in the state. They worried, not without reason, that these practices would continue after his return from the East, and that their opportunities for advancement would be determined by Caesar's affinity for them, as well as their pledges to respect his post-war order, instead of their relative merits as scions of grand noble lineages. We can thus understand why even those who fought on his side during the Civil War found the status quo untenable. Again, our ignorance of Caesar's long-term plans places us in a bind, but it does allow us to recognize just how much perception of a regime matters more than reality to its stakeholders, something that becomes more significant when the decision-making process is highly centralized or opaque. It is my belief that uncertainty regarding Caesar's plans for magisterial elections had a much greater impact on the conspirators' choices than the supposed slights and faux pas that Caesar is recorded as having made to the dignity of the Senate, many accounts of which reek of later embellishment. This decision to forego normal elections and place his thumb on the scale for a succession of favored candidates must be read as Caesar solidifying the Roman political scene in preparation for a long-term absence. Thus, the view of him as a potential monarch by the Roman elite is inextricably tied to his plans for a war with Parthia. This is of course not to say that these ambitions did not exist, or that the war was not a vehicle to raise his own standing so as to advance them. Rather, that by discounting Caesar's military plans entirely, we are left with only one flawed reading of his actions, where the logical end goal is monarchy alone, and the assassination is in effect justified when viewed only from the perspective of the assassins. It is natural to be uncomfortable with the uncertainty that this injects into these events. But if it is any solace, we can remember that we are not alone in guessing and second-guessing at Caesar's intentions. This lack of clarity would only enhance fears that he sought a crown, and a rumor spread that the Sibylline oracles decreed that Parthia could only be conquered by a Roman monarch. Plutarch reports that this frightened his opponents and spurred them to action. The most open and deadly hatred toward him was produced by his passion for the royal power. For the multitude, this was a first cause of hatred, and for those who had long smothered their hate, a most specious pretext for it. And yet those who were advocating this honor for Caesar actually spread abroad among the people a report that, from the Sibylline books, it appeared that Parthia could be taken if the Romans went up against it with a king, but otherwise could not be assailed. However, it must be noted that Cassius, a lead conspirator in the anti-Caesar plot, was a member of the college tasked with interpreting these oracles, and thus would be equipped to publicly debunk them if needed. Appian's interpretation of the exact same event paints a much different portrait of Caesar, helping to illustrate that conflicts exist between the sources, complicating the narrative. And now another rumor gained currency that the Sibylline books had predicted that the Parthians would never submit to the Romans until the latter should be commanded by a king. For this reason, some people ventured to say that Caesar ought to be called dictator and emperor of the Romans, as he was in fact, or whatever other name they might prefer to that of king. But he ought to be distinctly named king of the nations that were subject to the Romans. Caesar declined this also, and was wholly engaged in hastening his departure from the city, in which he was exposed to such envy. So Caesar made plans to leave Rome on March 18th, to begin the war he hoped would reunify a fractured republic, joining his grandnephew Octavian in the east to further coordinate invasion plans. Again, this was just 6 months after his return, indicating that domestic politics were not his primary concern. But before Caesar could leave, he had one final Senate meeting to attend, the fateful Ides of March session. It is often stated that Caesar was reluctant to attend due to his wife's prophetic visions, and only agreed when told that the point of the meeting was that the Senate was prepared to make him king. But this tradition does not appear until long after his death, and bears all the hallmarks of narrative embellishment. In reality, Cicero's Second Philippic, dated to just a year after the assassination, states that the Senate was convening to discuss Mark Antony's obstruction of Dolabella's nomination as suffect consul. This is significant because it indicates that Antony, as consul, was openly, and apparently without any fear of retribution, acting in opposition to Caesar's stated goals. Antony, as an augur, used his religious authority to halt Dolabella's nomination. However, instead of directly overruling Antony, Caesar behaved like a good Republican, and deferred to the Senate on the matter. But soon after this session was convened, the conspirators sprung into action, believing that this was their final opportunity to eliminate Caesar, and trusting not in old age, fate, or even Parthian arrows to do the job for them. So, what was set to be a rather mundane meeting of the Senate would become the most famous day in Roman history, and one that secured Caesar's legacy in a way that resonated through time, that not even victory over Parthia would have. He thus became the third member of the first triumvirate to die violently and unexpectedly, betrayed by those who concealed their desire to do him harm. Caesar died because his single-minded pursuit of a campaign to avenge Crassus caused him to neglect the impact his policies were having on ambitious Roman aristocrats. Caesar died in Pompey's theater, underneath a statue of the great man, who had once been his friend and ally. And, just like the great general, his final act was to draw his toga over his head, to hide the shame of his death. But the superficial similarities should not be overblown, for his two colleagues in the triumvirate died in desperate conditions after significant military defeats, but Caesar died after his victory, and on the cusp of what was to be his crowning achievement. Because of this, Caesar was the only member of the triumvirate to receive a proper funeral and burial. Ironically, his funeral occurred on March 18th, the date he had set for his departure to the east. He had hoped to unify the Roman world in this war of conquest, but as his body burned on the pyre, and the dictator left Rome forever, the famous funeral oration of Mark Antony would inflame the passions of the Romans against the assassins, making another round of civil war inevitable. The very next day, as Caesar's will was read, Rome was shocked to discover that he had named his relatively unknown grandnephew Octavian as his son and heir. Rome had rid itself of Caesar, but the Caesars were here to stay.